to Abby Norderhog, who is our moderator today. Abby?
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our CoSA member webinar on restarting or revitalizing your SHRAB. All right, sorry, I'm having some audio trouble here. I think I'm unmuted now. So we are joined today by three presenters who are all going to share their experiences with the SHRABs in their various states. First up today, we have Dan Stokes, who's the Director of State Programs at the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, also known as the NHPRC. His bachelor's and master's degrees are from the University of Cincinnati, where he studied history and historic preservation. He began working for the NHPRC in 1987 and was appointed Director of State Programs in 2009. Following Dan, we will hear from Emeline Alexander, who's the State Records Archivist at the Library of Virginia. After earning her MLIS from Simmons University, she started in records management at the library and began serving as a deputy coordinator for the SHRAB in 2020. After finishing her maternity leave last month, she's excited to be back processing records and getting the Virginia SHRAB back on track. And then we'll have Sally Blanchard-O'Brien at the Vermont Historical Records Program. She's the roving archivist. She's been working for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration since 2012 and is the for the VHRP beginning in the fall of 2019. Sally has a Master's of Library and Information Science from San Jose State University and became a certified archivist in 2020. Following all three presenters, we'll open it up for Q&A, so you can feel free to ask any questions in the chat as we go along. Otherwise, you can always chat them in following the presentations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to give a brief overview of some ideas that the Commission uses for reactivating boards, because I saw through the slide, I've already seen the slides that are coming up, and they're going to be providing a lot of very good information. So I want to leave enough time for that, and then for a lot of questions and conversation at the end. As you can imagine, at different times over the decades, we've had different numbers of active boards. Currently, we have awarded grants to 26 states. There are other boards that exist that don't get funding, but we have grants out for 26 states at the current time. And we've been glad to add North Dakota, Rhode Island, Virginia, and South Carolina to the active fold in recent years with new grants. You'll be hearing about one of those. We've also been doing pretty well in successions. When the state archivist leaves and then someone new comes in, that's often a time when things, when boards can become inactive. But we've had pretty good success with that. With recent retirements, people have come in and have been working to keep their boards active. So that's been working out really well. There's a few areas that I think help activate boards. Some work in some states, some work in others. It kind of depends on your structure. One is that often your boards have to be appointed by the governor, and governors don't always do that in a timely manner or a sufficient manner for you. So we do want to make sure it's clear to everyone that the governor does not have to do this based on federal regulations. You may have a state regulation or state law that requires this, but some states don't. It's maybe just in their bylaws. So in several states, the board is appointed by the head of the agency that oversees the archives, or by someone else, much further down in the layer of bureaucracy from the governor. So keep that in mind. If you can somehow potentially, and you think it'll work in your state, potentially transfer that appointment authority away from a governor who maybe has not been as reactive to your needs as necessary. Obviously lots of legal, political things going on there, but some boards have been successful in moving that appointment authority away. Another area that I think has been helpful is for state boards that have used members of the board or members who might become, people who might become members of the board to take on some of the activities and leadership roles. Often we have found that if a state is building a new building, or if either state archives or a new museum is going up that needs exhibit help, things like that, and that takes up the time of the archive staff, the board will become inactive because it's been the state archive staff that has been committing all the time to keeping the board functioning. So some states have been able to spread the work around among members of the board so that when one person becomes busier, other people can take on the work. Some boards, the state archivist is officially the state coordinator, but doesn't chair the board. There's a separate chair, and that person helps plan for meetings, follow up on activities, and keep things running. So considering that spreading the work around outside of the state archives can often be helpful to keep the place running. Also, we began a few years ago to add 2 levels of funding to our grant sources. And some of you, maybe Howard Law remembers this. We used to have the travel and meeting expense grants and the planning grants and things like that that were used by boards that were just getting started. We don't have those anymore as separate grants, but everything is now put together into one state board programming grant. But those are still available, those basic level activities. So you can apply for a level 1 grant from us, and that will support initial planning efforts. If you want to conduct surveys, you'll be hearing about that later. Surveys of repositories in your state to figure out what should we be doing, what activities do people want. Offer some basic training. Rhode Island has done that just as a starter project, or to offer scholarships for training. These are well, simple activities. They can sometimes not require the level of staffing and resources that like a re-grant program would require, or some other large type of grant. I also want to share that we're trying to be less restrictive. So you can apply for a grant even if your board has not yet been appointed, but the process has started. What might happen is we would require that the grant money would not be released until the governor had appointed the board. And sometimes that is a helpful hint to the governor. Well, we could have this $10,000 or $12,000 grant if we had board appointments and we're ready to move forward with the activities. So think about that, even if you aren't fully in place and haven't completely met, that you could potentially still apply. I saw in the chat that some folks have kind of had an initial meeting or have an initial meeting coming up. So those grants can come in, and we'll try to work with you to make sure that everything's in place at the time that the funding shows up on your doorstep. Also, I saw some folks who, and I believe we talked about this at the last meeting we had about this topic. You're kind of 6 months or 9 months or 12 months away from really getting your board established. You've kind of done some preliminary work. So we would like to hear from you at that point as well to help lend a hand. We're not just here to give you the money to do your work. We also want to help you figure out how to get your board together, how to get them interested. Sometimes people on the boards do get burnt out for the longer term boards. And so we're here to help in any way we can. Also, if you have virtual meetings, we can attend your virtual meetings. I've attended full meetings of some boards and then just done 10 and 15-minute presentations for others to kind of provide either some training for new members or information about what the NHPRC is up to these days, or anything else that might help. Often I'll be involved in like re-grant discussions to let people know that the commission is especially interested in that type of project, or we're not really very supportive of that other type of project, to help them decide what type of projects to do. So think about that. Even if you're a year away from applying, the next deadline is June of this year, and some new boards have submitted drafts that I'll be reading and giving them comments on. But even if you're a year away, or you're not even sure when you're going to be ready, let me know, because we do want to help you along each step of the way, so that you can get off on a firm footing. So Abby, I will let the others take over.
Okie dokie. Hello, everyone. I'm Emeline Alexander. I'm a state records archivist at the Library of Virginia. Starting last year, I was put on the task of being the deputy coordinator for restarting our SHRAB. As a bit of background on the Virginia SHRAB, just like I'm assuming most of y'all, ours was established in the 1970s. It was initially very active. I actually just processed all of the records we have from the SHRAB in the 70s and 80s. They reviewed grants, hosted workshops, supported conference scholarships. Sometime in the 90s, early thousands, it fell off. Unfortunately, due to staffing shortages here at the Library of Virginia, with nobody at the helm, there was nobody to sort of lead SHRAB. Currently, we have 11 members who are appointed by the governor for 3-year terms. The last administration was very active in filling those roles with SHRAB, so hopefully they will keep staying on. A lot of people wanted to be reappointed once we started sort of contacting them more, so I'm optimistic about the group we have. Most of them are involved with university libraries, public libraries, or museums around the state. In 2020, our former state archivist applied for and received a grant from NHPRC to help plan to restart the SHRAB. This enabled us to hire a consultant and host a board retreat with the goal of creating a new strategic plan and sort of restarting things after so many years of inactivity. 2020 made us pause this for a bit, but in 2021, we finally got things underway. The survey was created in part by me and the then state archivist. It was then reviewed by the board members and then sent out. I could spend an hour going through each of the questions that we went, why we decided it, so on and so forth, but I only got 10 minutes. But it was essentially, here are each point of the current strategic plan and the mission. Are these relevant to your institutions? Are they no longer relevant? Do you know what SHRAB is? Have you ever interacted with SHRAB? Did you have a positive experience? And then we wanted to see where the different institutions are sort of in their various archival processes. Do they want to focus on preservation? Do they want to digitize things? Do they need boxes? Do they need disaster plans? Do they need help writing grants? Seeing where they are, what they wanted help with, and if we were to institute a re-grant program, how popular would that be with people? Do they want to just stick with applying to grants with the NHPRC and having us review them as the SHRAB? It was sent out to 250 repositories, higher education institutions, archives, local libraries, museums, genealogical societies, and the circuit courts in the state. We had a 28% response rate, which is pretty good for surveys. It isn't, you always want more than that, but we'll take what we can get. It was a pretty good response rate. The results, a majority found that the goals were still very or somewhat relevant to their institutions. Unsurprisingly, most had not interacted with SHRAB before, didn't know it existed. I think we got a response that said they had no idea that SHRAB existed until we sent out the email. There's significant interest in digital collections, preservation, conservation, and electronic records. When asked if they were interested in a re-grant program of about $2,500 per grant, it was about 80% said yes, 10% said maybe, and a very small fraction said no, unsure. The no, unsure were large institutions that didn't need small grants, and small institutions who were, in their words, concerned about the strings that would be attached with applying for small re-grants. So overall, very positive. And as seen on this little image, most people wanted help with digitizing collections, preservation, conservation, and then electronic records management or processing collections. So big emphasis on digital collections and preserving things. After the survey was complete, we met with a consultant who helped us sort of make it all presentable and digestible to the board. And then we met on June 1st for what ended up being an all-day discussion on the board, the goals, the priorities, the strategic plan, the mission, what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. This was facilitated by the consultant who helped get the discussion going, pushing things along, making notes, and they were really great. Highly recommend a consultant. They know what they're doing. The result was a new strategic plan with reworked priorities, objections, and points of discussion going forward. I'd be happy to share those if you want to email me after the presentation. We don't have it on the website yet. We're still waiting on that. And the new focus for the new strategic plan are accessibility, preservation, and records management, at least for the Virginia SHRAB. Going forward, we will be meeting to formally finalize the new strategic plan, doing the voting, the formal process of it, and then defining the role of SHRAB going forward, since it hasn't been active in a number of years, and because the board members, none of them were on SHRAB. When it was active, we're going to decide, do we want committees? Do we want to do re-grants? Do we want to have a board chair? We're going to have term limits for different committees, so on and so forth. I'm pretty excited about it. This probably won't happen until we get a new state archivist, which will hopefully, fingers crossed, be in the next couple months. So, and I think that's about it for me.
Thank you, Emeline. I'm Sally Blanchard-O'Brien. I'm the roving archivist for the Vermont Historical Records Program, and I'm going to be talking about the statewide survey that we conducted last spring and how we're using the data to inform the services that we provide to Vermont's historical records repositories. First, a little bit of a background about the Vermont Historical Records Program, or the VHRP. So the VHRP started in May 2017 with funding from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission and the Vermont Secretary of State. So it's a program of the Vermont State Historical Records Advisory Board, and it's based at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. So the members of the Vermont SHRAB don't really have the capacity to take on programmatic work. So their solution was to develop a program, the VHRP, that achieves the goals that they'd like, and then to build capacity over time through the state board programming grants, and through the collaboration and support with the state archivist and the Vermont Secretary of State. So because of our funding, we're able to provide several free services to historical records repositories around the state. And thanks to dedicated staffing, we can be fairly assured that our program's work is sustainable. So over the past couple of years, the VHRP has grown from 1 part-time employee to 2 full-time employees. So with our expanded capacity, we wanted to gauge the needs of our constituents to better target our services. And to do that, we decided to send out a survey. So our survey actually has origins in work that began over 20 years ago. So 1997, the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities issued a report that called for the need to assess the nation's preservation needs. So then the Institute of Museum and Library Services and Heritage Preservation took that call, and they surveyed the condition of collections stored around America in libraries, historical societies, and museums. In 2005, the Heritage Health Index report was released and had very startling results about the condition of materials around the country. This led to the development of the Connecting to Collections program, which looked at collections needs at the state level. So in 2008, the Vermont Historical Society and other state partners received a grant to assess Vermont's collections. Several years later, Heritage Preservation undertook a follow-up survey to assess what changes happened since the first national survey. So the VHRP decided that we wanted to build upon all of this previous data and to determine what has changed in Vermont between 2008 and now. So our survey had, can't get the slide to change. Next slide, Becky. Okay, there we go. Technical difficulties. We had 3 goals for our survey, and it was to first identify what technical assistance Vermont historical records repositories want and need, and how to best deliver that support, how to best publicize the VHRP and its services, and then to get a snapshot of the state's cultural heritage in 2021, and to compare that to the data from 2008 from the Connecting to Collection survey. So we based our survey on many of the questions from the 2008 Connecting to Collection survey for Vermont to allow for a comparison between data points. So some questions were left out, generally because they were too specific when we were trying to get a broader sense of conditions, or because the information within those questions was either not that important for our purposes or was conveyed through other means. Some other questions were simplified, and a few new questions were added to touch on current issues such as social media usage. Some of the survey questions gathered facts, asking for specific data like how many employees or whether or not an activity was being performed. And other questions asked respondents to rank choices such as levels of need in certain areas or preferences in training topics. We decided to load the survey into Microsoft Forms. Our office operates completely on Microsoft 365, so Forms was no extra cost for us to use. Forms was the platform through which the respondents could answer the questions. It stored the data for us, and it did perform some data analysis automatically. And the survey is completely reliant on self-reporting. So that means it's reliable in that it captures the respondents' perspectives about what's going on. But it is possible that we might read the situation a little differently if we were to fill out the survey for them after doing a site visit. So we compiled a master contact list that consisted of mostly the same types of institutions that were surveyed in 2008. The master list was developed from existing contact lists used previously by the VHRP and by statewide organizations such as the Department of Libraries and the Historical Society and the Office of the Secretary of State. We then broke that master list into 4 different contact groups, depending on whether or not they had had previous contact with the VHRP and thus already knew about our services and what we do, and whether or not they had responded to the 2008 Connecting to Collection survey. So this helped us better target our communication about our survey. Before the survey launch, general announcements about the survey were sent out to relevant listservs. We distributed the survey via email with a link to the Microsoft form, tailoring the message for each of the 4 groups. For those groups that did not have previous contact with us, an email message was sent introducing the VHRP and its services. And institutions that responded to the 2008 survey were sent copies of those responses. We thought that getting a copy of the responses would encourage a response to our survey in 2021, but it did also provide the institution with a self-reported snapshot of their organization from over a decade ago. We were able to do this because the Vermont Historical Society shared a spreadsheet of the 2008 data with us, which we then imported into an Access database. And that made it possible to run a custom report for each respondent sent only to that respondent. And respondents filled out the survey online. Responses were stored within the Microsoft Forms application. Responding institutions were tracked in a spreadsheet, and reminders were sent to institutions that did not respond, with the VHRP director personally following up with a handful of organizations who had had previous contact with us. We had a 23.5 response rate, which is okay, but it was lower than our target of 35%, which was maybe ambitious, but that was based on the response rate for the 2008 Connecting to Collection survey. The data from the VHRP survey was first analyzed through the Microsoft Forms software, and then it was placed in a spreadsheet along the numbers from the other surveys for comparison. So we calculated rates of increase and decrease between 2008 and 2021, and that was calculated right in the spreadsheet. And then that became the basis for our narrative final report. We developed infographics for the three different audiences, and we created a general presentation that summarized the results. And we added the survey data to the same Access database as the connecting to collections data. So that allows us to continue to track change over time for individual repositories. And that database now serves as our master contact list going forward. So there are some important things to note about our survey analysis. We conducted the survey from start to finish totally in-house. We did not pay for additional software, so we used what was already available to us. Our 2021 survey has a smaller sample size than the 2008 results, so this may affect the accuracy of some data comparisons. And we also couldn't directly compare the data where questions were asked differently between the two surveys. And our survey was analyzed by us, and we are not professional statistical analysts. So it's important to take that into account when looking at our results. So that being said, after analyzing the data, we identified what we thought were some key takeaways. Many of the same issues identified in the 2008 survey still hold true, though there has been some slight improvement in some areas. It likely comes as no surprise that the most drastic differences between 2008 and 2021 are in relation to digital materials. So the responsibility of caring for digital materials has increased significantly from 2008. Nearly half of respondents now offer online access to some of their content. Almost 2/3 engage in social media, and 68% get online visitors through websites or online exhibits. So there's more digital material to handle and an increased expectation of remote access. And based on these takeaways, the VHRP decided to focus its future services and programming in the following areas: emergency preparedness and disaster planning, because less than 1/3 of respondents have disaster plans, and because emergency preparedness has remained among the top choices of training subjects, and it's ranked as the top area of need. Cataloging, inventories, and intellectual control, because our survey shows that intellectual control remains a big risk factor for Vermont, as 59% of people have less than half or don't know how much is cataloged. Proper housing and storage, because storage and enclosures are the second highest reported cause of damage to collections, and collection storage has remained the top choices for training subjects. Digital preservation, because it ranks as the second highest area of overall need, combined with the large increase of digital materials cared for by respondents, and the fact that technology is almost the last choice for spending priorities. This shows that digital cultural heritage is definitely at risk, and steps should be taken to mitigate that before it's too late. And our last takeaway area was causes of deterioration and information about conservation. Physical and chemical deterioration are the biggest reported cause of collections damage, and conservation treatment is ranked as the 3rd highest area of need. So we've begun to connect these priority areas to the services we offer to Vermont's historical records repositories. We had already planned in our previous grant cycle to launch an environmental monitoring program and a mobile digitization unit. So these will be launched this year and will connect to the priority areas of deterioration causes and digital preservation. Offering workshops was also included in our previous grant, but those workshops are being developed in line with the priority areas. So VHRP co-presented an Inventory 101 workshop last fall, and will be co-presenting a 4-part cataloging series later this spring. We're also using some of our programming grant funds to have the NEDCC lead a digital preservation workshop in different areas around the state. We're beginning to create online training modules consisting of a series of short videos, quizzes, and other relevant materials to address these priority areas, and have just completed one about emergency preparedness. In fall of 2021, we launched our virtual office hours, an informal once-a-month opportunity for people to network with each other and to ask questions of the VHRP staff. At times, these sessions have a broad theme to focus the discussion, and future sessions will be focused around these priority areas. And finally, our site visits allow us to see on the ground what an institution's experience and level of need is within each of these priority areas. So follow-up conversations will center on the individual priorities identified in that site's specific report, but the discussion will also touch on any progress made in these identified priority areas. So our survey process took us from existing data to build upon it with our own survey instrument. We analyzed the self-reported data, and then from that analysis, to the best of our ability, we first identified the key trends that emerged, translated that into service areas that focus on statewide gaps, And from there, I began developing our services and activities that can help to close those gaps. In all, the process took about 6 months from the initial idea to the final report. And that work was done in conjunction with regular duties and activities. Ultimately, the survey gives us a framework in which to center our offerings so that we can help develop our state's historical records repositories in the areas needed. And that in turn helps preserve Vermont's cultural heritage for future generations. So if you want to spend some more time with these reports and our own survey materials, you can find them at these links. And that is all I have. So I will turn it back to you, Abby.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks to Emeline and Dana as well. We are now going to be open for some questions and answers. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask our presenters directly. So I'll give everybody just a minute to think up their great questions and get them in the chat or get your hand raised. And I have a couple of questions just to get us started here. And I'm going to start with Emeline. Could you talk about what you see as the biggest obstacle for the Virginia SHRAB going forward?
For us is keeping the momentum going. We had a good start in June. We have the grant process. Unfortunately, we don't have a state archivist at the moment, and our current acting coordinator, this is not his primary responsibility. It was never intended to be one of his responsibilities. So he has several other hats that he is wearing. So wrangling him and wrangling the board to keep everything going is probably what's going to hold us back until we get that state archivist who can step into the role of coordinating the SHRAB, since the Library of Virginia is the one who sort of helms it and then herds all of the cats together to get things going.
Thanks. Claire, you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Becky, can you unmute Claire?
Claire
Oh,
says,
just an accident.
Claire says
Okay.
just an accident. But we have a question for Sally from Charles Busby, who wants to know what was the size of your 2021 survey pool?
Yeah, we sent it out to about 660 institutions, and we got back, I think it was 155 responses. It did actually represent like 160-ish people or repositories, because there were a few repositories that were actually conjoined, and there was one person filling out the survey for both entities.
Thanks. And I see a couple of people in the chat are asking for the lists of articles. Was that something, Lisa, maybe that can be sent out after the webinar,
Or if Sally has them and wants to put them in chat, otherwise we'll get them and make that available.
All right, thanks. Cindy Sheen is asking if there's any online resources or sample surveys that either of you would recommend.
We built ours from scratch based on our current SHRAB strategic mission goals and plans. And I'm happy to send that to Lisa to send out afterwards as a PDF form, since the Google form is now closed.
And we based ours on an existing survey. It was the one that was sent in 2008 from the Connecting to Collections program. So I will send out the links to you, Lisa, so that they can be sent out to everybody for all the reports. But at the end of our report, we actually have the instrument that we give, so you could see all the questions that we did.
Dan, are you aware of any sample surveys that are online for states to take a look at?
There's the two that obviously were just mentioned. Other states have not done surveys terribly recently. What I can do is go back and check and see if there are some that might be useful. As it was mentioned, they tend to be very geared toward what a specific board wants to see, but I think they'd still be useful even if they're very specific. So I'll go back and see what other boards may have done surveys recently.
Thanks. And we have a question for Dan from Karen Gray. She is wondering, is there still a requirement that the SHRAB board must be active for 1 year before applying for a state board programming grant?
No, you don't have to even be active yet to apply. Let's say the best practice would be for the board to get together for a few meetings, decide what they want to do, put together an application after they may not be active, but they've been appointed and they've at least met and know what they want to do, and then put something together, maybe to develop a strategic plan or to do some basic programming that they know needs to be done even without any kind of planning or surveying. So what I try to do is not cause a board to have to delay for an entire year when they might lose any momentum they might have. So if you think you are ready to start doing some work in 2023, you might want to apply in this round, so you don't have to necessarily wait.
Thanks, Dan. Cindy Sheen has their hand raised. Cindy, if you'd like to unmute, you could ask your question.
Hi, Nevada has had a vacancy for its state archivist position for more than 5 years, and we are definitely looking forward to getting up and running. The question I have is, looking through the history of the SHRAB previously, they've done surveys, they've done strategic plans, they've done all these planning things, but then it never went to the next step. I was encouraged by Sally's information about here's how we took it to the next step, here's how we used the survey to implement some of the changes that will support the information we got in the survey. Are there any other examples of good implementation projects that would inspire us to be able to move to the next step? And I think part of it has been mentioned, momentum that Emeline mentioned, and then also just sustainability. How do we keep going with these things? We have great ideas, but how do we follow through?
Do any of our panelists have any thoughts on sustainability and follow through?
I wish I did. I wish I could help you. That's what we're that's what we're working on, is just getting to that next step, which I think for us, our board is really excited and ready to go, especially some of the new members that have been appointed. So I think that's definitely encouraging on our end. It's just having a board that wants to be active and involved instead of just having the title of being on the board.
And
And
Abby,
it
go ahead,
is,
Dan.
yeah, difficult to basically you need people who want to be on the board and who were not just appointed to the board. You need people to be excited about what their programming is. I know there are some situations where the board isn't even involved in the application process, and so they may feel no connection to the activities that funding has been provided for, and they just kind of are there to meet a few times a year with no great purpose. So having that kind of involvement, like I said, of having people who are on committees, who maybe service chair, so that there is a level of commitment to what's going on. Now, when you do a strategic plan, we've had this comment before, is I've got 12 of them gathering dust on a shelf. That's the problem. Often I encourage people, as part of the strategic planning process, is even if it's a year ahead, schedule your implementation meeting. Say, within this many months of our receiving this report, we will have a retreat, a one-day retreat somewhere nice, to talk about it and to develop new programming and to just prepare folks for that, so that it isn't just, well, the report's in, read it and see what you think. Having some kind of a process in place for actually implementing what you've planned. I think back when we had the planning grant program, that was a big problem because people just got the money for their planning grant and then nothing happened. They just had the plan and they look nice. They're sitting on a shelf in our back room, and some of them have actually been useful. But others, it was just, now we're done, and then they never applied for another grant. So finding ways to keep the interest and keep the board members involved and not just use them as kind of an advisory group every, 2 or 3 times a year in meetings, but keeping them involved all the time.
Abby, I can add a little bit. I'm an active member of the New Mexico SHRAB, and our board fluctuates in its level of commitment. Of course, the pandemic years did not help because obviously we couldn't get together, but I would say the most important thing our board does is we don't try to take everything on at one time. We pick one project to start with and we get it going. So we have used some of our grant money to sponsor workshops where we bring in specific presenters, particularly for topics that we don't have in-state expertise, like dealing with oversize or audio materials or something like that. So that we, and then offer it widely to the community, both governmental and, out in the museum and other archive realm. We have a re-grant program. We've been doing the re-grant program for probably 20 years. And some years we get better response than others. So what we have to encourage our board members to do is really, they are the conduit to get the information out to their network about the grants. So I would recommend that as a thing that the board can do. When you are doing something, have them help get the word out. And then the last thing I would offer is another source of members for your board. Look to your local governments as your municipal clerks, because in most states, they are also the records managers for that municipality. And oftentimes they also hold historic records. They just don't always recognize it. But you'll know in your state who might be interested, but they can be a very good asset to your board and bring another level and another network too, because they can then reach out to their other municipal clerks when you guys are having training, or if you have a grant program or whatever it is that you're doing. So those are just some comments from New Mexico.
Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate those ideas, particularly the local government for board members, because that's one thing we struggle with in Wisconsin is adding members to our board. So Charles Busby had a question for Dan, which is, what projects have been carried out regarding statewide permanent government records inventories for counties and the resources boards requested to carry it out?
We haven't had any projects like that from boards. We've had a few where some things like record schedules, county record schedules for every county were created through our larger projects, what's now called the Archival Projects grant program. And either our board or our state archives is eligible to apply for those. You don't have to just stick with the board. Ohio has done sent out students to various county archives to look for manumission records specifically and to create inventories of those. So that's possibly a model for something like this, where the students went to 11 counties, searched various types of records, and then found manumission records, and then created an inventory. And then the next year they got another grant and sent them to 9 more counties and kind of did it a piecemeal way like that, because it is a more expensive type project. And like I said, they used student workers who spent their summers digging through the record books in several counties. So that's one way to do it piecemeal, and many thousands of years ago, there were some microfilming projects where they did film records, and they went county by county and just did it piecemeal to fit within the funding, because we do have $40,000 annual limit on the funding for the state boards. So you might want to look at the Ohio board's website, and you'll see the inventories and also some storyboards that the students put together, and that might provide and reports on what the project was, and that might help you formulate a different type, slightly different type of project.
Thanks, Dan. I just wanted to add one note from the chat that Rachel Onoff says she did a survey for the New Jersey SHRAB in the 90s that she's willing to share. So if anybody's looking for a sample survey, Rachel would be a good contact for you. If anybody else has any questions, they'd like to raise their hand and ask, or just put in the chat. This would be a great time. I did have one question for Sally, and I was just wondering, Sally, if you could talk about the types of organizations that you sent your survey to. Oh, you're on mute.
Muted. So we did public libraries, town clerks, local historical societies, small museums, and academic archives and libraries.
And did you notice that one of those groups was more likely to respond?
We got a lot of responses from public libraries and local historical societies. I think historical societies were the most, and yeah, but we had a pretty good mix, which was great.
Abby, one of the things when you reach out, particularly to the local government people, particularly town clerks and municipal clerks, is they don't consider themselves archivists, even though they may very well hold permanent and archival kinds of records. In fact, that's one of the areas we're working with clerks on from that side, saying, hey, you know, because you hold these records, you really are in archives and you really are an archivist. So you may have to convince them, because sometimes when they see that there's a class happening and it has the word archives in it, they'll immediately shut it down because they're like, oh, I'm not in archives, that doesn't mean me. So you may have to either phrase it differently or reach out to them slightly differently to say, hey, no, we really want you involved in this as well.
And on the subject of local archives, Virginia actually has a very good and robust local archives program in relation with our circuit court clerks. So if anybody's interested, I can give you the contact for our local records program manager. I don't know how they do it, but they're very involved with the circuit court clerks and getting everything preserved and archived. And the clerks themselves are super involved with working with us at the LVA to get everything preserved and digitized.
Thanks. So it looks like we've got time for just another one or two questions. If anybody has anything else they'd like to ask any of our presenters. And Emeline, it looks like you're getting a lot of positive feedback on your on your volunteering to share. So sounds like that's a topic lots of folks are interested in. Dan, Cindy'd like to know if there's anything that should be avoided in Restart grant applications.
The only main issue is requesting funds for something we don't fund. That's can be a problem. Sometimes people don't read the announcement closely, and so they request funding. That hasn't happened yet for a state board, where it was just, this is not something we fund. But we've had, as you can imagine, some people apply under this program who aren't even state boards, and we're asked to start small businesses, and we have to say, Yeah, wrong button on grants.gov. So that's not us. So basically, really the only thing to avoid is, as was mentioned earlier, taking on too much. Find those one or two small things that you know you can do and you know you can keep interest in and you know the board members will support, and then build your programming over time. From what I can remember, most of the boards that are doing 4 or 5 big programs now did not start out that way. They started out with doing 3 workshops a year or offering a few scholarships or things like that. And then they built up until they did larger programs. So try to keep it simple and something that the board will successfully carry through.
Thanks, Dan. So Lisa, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in.
Okay, well, if that's the case, Becky, let's go ahead and reshare your screen and we'll finish everything up. And if you can give me control, I'm controlling it now. All right. There we go. So thank you all for the great questions and comments. You know, obviously there's a lot of interest in this, and so hopefully we can build on this and keep reaching out to each other to share and help. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you'll sign up for our May webinar. Our member webinars are the 4th Thursday of every month. So if you just want to go in, just register for all of them. The links are there already on the website. We don't have all the topics yet, but I promise you they're all going to be interesting. The ones that are there, you can find out. But May, we're going to talk about disaster planning. How do you monitor collections during adverse conditions? So we have some really good speakers going to be sharing some information on that. So I hope you'll look at that. Of course, don't forget our SERI webinars. Our May 10th webinar will be called, Are You Prepared? So this is going to be some things that we've learned from the Prepare Grant Phase 2 and how that's going to impact you and things that might help you. So we hope you'll check out both of those. As always, we have lots of ways to stay in touch with CoSA. Reach out to us, however works best for you. Stay involved, be part of what we're doing. And of course, none of this is possible without funding from our sponsors and our other funders. So we do a shout out to all of them every time we do one of these. And finally, when we finish and end this webinar today, we really do appreciate your feedback. There is an evaluation that's going to automatically open. So please just take a couple of minutes and respond to those questionnaires. It really does help our education committee as they move forward planning their programs. So with that, Abby, any final last words?
No, thanks to everybody for joining us today, and thank you so much to our presenters.
Presenters, any last words? We thank you very much for sharing with us today.
I put our local records program manager's email in the chat box if anybody wants to need it, and I will let him know that I did that, so he's prepared.
Excellent. And with that, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope that you will reach out to each other. The building the SHRAB is, you don't do it in a silo. It's a community effort. And why reinvent the wheel? We've got some people out here who've already gone through parts of it. And I'm sure they'll be glad to help you however they can. And of course, Dan at NHPRC is always willing to provide insight and help. So with that, thank you all for joining us today for the CoSA member webinar, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Take care, everyone.